Okay, keep checking my time. As you can probably see from my screen share, it looks like it is noon. So we will get going with our webinar. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on the Electrified City. My name is Joe Wachunas. I work for Solar Oregon. For those of you who don't know, Solar Oregon has been a nonprofit for over 40 years, educating on clean energy, energy efficiency, and climate change. So thank you so much for being here with us today. Our work is made possible, of course, with membership, and we couldn't get through a webinar with a membership plug. So we will thank our hundreds of members. Those of you who signed up for this webinar and became a member, thank you so much. If you'd like to become a member and support us, we'll put a link in the chat room. Thanks so much to our members. A couple quick plugs of upcoming events. In 2 weeks, we're going to have a webinar on solar shingles. June 4th at 12 p.m. we will have the magazine Solar Power World and Tesla to talk about this new and exciting technology. So we hope you can join us. June 24th and 25th, our umbrella organization ASIS, the American Solar Energy Society, will be having their Solar 2020 conference. It's their first all virtual conference. We hope you'll join us there. It's a fantastic conference in a couple weeks. I want to introduce my co-host today, Brian Stewart. He's a good friend of our organization, and we partner a lot with Electrified now, who gives everyone a chance to create a clean energy future. So Brian today will be helping me both manage the Q&A section. You can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you have a button to push for Q&A for our panelists, and as well as the chat for general ideas, your chat button. Just a note on to how the Q&A will be going. We will have our panelists do their presentations, and then we'll save the Q&A for the end. We also, of course, love to do polls here at Solar Oregon, so let me get my first poll up today. We're interested in everyone's background who's joining us, so I'm going to launch our first poll. What is your background? Policy, building design, utility, developer, nonprofit, just an interested community member. So we'll give about 10, 15 seconds, see how this polling goes, and then we will release the results and then dive into our presentation. All right, another 5 seconds to finish up our poll. Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much, everyone. Here's our polling results. Very fascinating mix of people here today. Very excited and excited to see all who will join. So let's get into our program. The Electrified City. I guess our first question today is what is electrification? Well, from a high level, electrification is when all the energy you use to power your life comes from electricity. And our panelists today will tell us why that's an important strategy to fight climate change. But why cities and electrification? Well, as many of us might know, less than 10 months ago, cities in California started to enact measures limiting or prohibiting the use of natural gas in new construction. And in a short 10 months, over 30 cities have enacted these measures in California, while dozens of other cities across the United States, from Seattle to Ann Arbor, have been considering similar proposals. In the absence of federal leadership on climate change in general, cities are stepping up, and that's a good thing, right? The cities are responsible for 70% of the world's energy-related carbon emissions. But big questions remain on electrifications and the role of cities within it. What's the best pathway to electrification? Who should lead the way? How do communities electrify equitably? And is it possible for fuels like natural gas to decarbonize? I'm so excited for our panelists today to tackle these questions. So let me get to introducing them. Our first panelist today will be Karina Hershberg, who's an engineer at PAE Consulting Engineers with experience in innovative electrical systems design. Karina will be focusing on the why of all electric. Our second panelist is Ken Davies. He's the Deputy Director for Climate Smart San José with the City of San Jose's Environmental Services Department. Ken will be talking about San Jose's pioneering REACH code and natural gas ban that went into effect last year. Our third guest is Andria Jacob, who directs a portfolio of clean energy programs and policy initiatives for the City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Andria will talk about what electrification means for the city in which many of us reside. Andria is also a former board member of Solar Oregon. And then our final guest is Carmelita Miller. She's the Energy Equity Legal Counsel for the nonprofit Greenlining. She'll be talking about Greenlining's equitable building electrification framework and the right and wrong ways to electrify equitably. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to ask our first panelist, Karina Hershberg, to take it away.
All right. All right. Does it look okay? Sound okay? Thumbs up, yes. All right, we're good. Okay, thanks, Joe. All right, yeah, so I'm Karina Hershberg. I am an electrical engineer. I also work in our building analysis and modeling group at PAE. And for those who are not familiar with us, we are an engineering design firm. We work mechanical, electrical, plumbing, lighting, technology, and then we have a phenomenal modeling and analysis group that does everything from energy modeling to greenhouse gas emissions analysis and all the things in between. And at PAE, we say that our vision is to help solve the planet's energy and water challenges, and electrification is certainly part of that effort. This is a piece that our president, Paul Schwer, and the head of our modeling department, David Mead, did for the G7 summit last year. And in it, they made the statement, if cities could do just one thing, it would be to electrify everything and let go of burning fossil fuels. And sort of the reasoning behind this kind of electrification movement, right, is this concept called the greening of the grid, and the idea that as the grids are getting progressively cleaner, as a building, if you are connected to a grid that is getting cleaner, then even if you do nothing else, you will by default get cleaner as well. And so it's a way to link decarbonization of the built environment with decarbonization of the electricity sector. And kind of on the flip side of it, natural gas, which is the other energy source available to us for buildings, is a fossil fuel, of course, and so it has emissions now, it will have emissions tomorrow, and so that same path to decarbonization doesn't exist on those systems. So as Joe mentioned, right, the Berkeley code that came out was pretty exciting. We've all been plugging away at this effort, kind of building by building, and so to see it come at, as a code at the policy level was wonderful, because that's a whole other different scale of change. And then of course we fast forward a year and poof, now we got 30 that are going this way. And I think the speed at which these codes have been implemented gave myself, and I know a number of my colleagues, kind of a moment pause, because when we saw sort of the rate of change that was happening on the technical side, we realized that there's sort of a professional and personal responsibility to sort of take a moment and say, okay, let's double check all of our numbers, let's cross our T's, dot our I's, make sure that we have got all the kinks worked out, so that way when this thing goes, it goes smoothly and it's done right from day one. And so what I'm going to be sharing today is an extremely distilled version of sort of my research journey and my back-checking my numbers journey around this issue. And what I will be addressing is kind of, these were sort of the 4 questions that I set out to answer. One is the grid getting cleaner, right? Let's back check that fundamental assumption. The next is that how will the new loads be supported, right? If we see a real increase in electrification and a lot of loads that maybe would have been natural gas now moving to electricity, making sure that they're also being met with renewable sources, and then we haven't just moved fossil fuels from one point to a different point. And then unintended consequences, and this is both the good and the bad, right? Are there additional benefits of electrification, and how making sure we identify them so that all projects are getting all the benefits available to them. And then, the flip side, of course, is are there pitfalls, right? Are there things that we need to watch out for, so that way we can make sure we have solutions in place day one, and so that we're not, having to go back and fix it 10 years down the road. And then the last one is kind of the most important of all, right? Is this the best path to decarbonization? Again, in the building industry, we sort of have 2 options for energy. We have electricity and natural gas has long been presented as the clean burning fuel and the bridging fuel, right? The bridge between coal and renewables. And so just doing one last check of those numbers and confirming that, yes, we have reached the other side of the bridge and it is time for us to transition. So first, are the grids getting cleaner? I'd say the data is a pretty resounding yes. This is looking at the national level, and obviously the largest amount of new resources coming online are in the category of renewables, some amount of new natural gas, but also a lot of natural gas that's scheduled for retirement, and then coal, of course. I think it's probably no surprise that sort of reached the end of its life in terms of having a role in the electricity sector. Regionally, I kind of want to touch on this a bit because this is sometimes we'll hear this critique of that. Well, the grids aren't clean enough yet. And the thing is that there's a lot of variation utility to utility and region to region. And so what my research really was focusing on was on the West Coast and kind of Oregon specifically. And what we have in our region is we already had grids that were already pretty clean. In fact, we have kind of two particular cases, Seattle City Light and EWEB, which are predominantly hydro. They're almost carbon free right now today without doing anything. They're already almost fully decarbonized. But then just in general, the grids on the West Coast are a little bit cleaner. And then the decarbonization plans, which we'll look at next, are on track to kind of meet their targets. So for our region in particular, the argument that the grids aren't clean enough yet, the data really does not support that. Okay, so where's this all coming from? So it generally starts at kind of the state level, setting decarbonization targets. And in California, they're always leading. They're always leading. They had 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045, and this obviously is good for California, but actually it's good for everybody because California is such a big market that whenever they do something, it really paves the way for the rest of us. And so we saw this with solar. We're seeing it now with storage. And we're expecting to see this with sort of the long duration utility storage that's needed. And so that's great. That means that by the time the rest of us are ready for it, the technologies are there and they're a lot cheaper than they would have otherwise been. In Oregon, we've taken a little different approach. We've set the 1990 emissions levels for the baseline and then set a requirement for an 80% reduction by 2050. So if we look at our two major utilities in Oregon, we've got Pacific Power and PGE, and this data is pulled out of what's called their integrated resource plans. So every 2 years, the utilities issue a document that is publicly available that sort of outlines their plan, and it kind of hits on the, who are we going to serve, how are we going to serve them, and who's going to pay for all of it. And that's where we're able to pull our data to kind of get a window into where they're heading. And the data is great. I mean, you look at what their plans are and it's all heading the right direction. PGE is on a trajectory to hit that the 80% reduction a decade ahead of schedule, right, which is great. And then even Pacific Power, I'll be honest, this was kind of one of the highlights of my little research effort was that I still had the 2017 numbers in my mind for Pacific Power, which was a sort of we'll get there, but we're going to take our time doing it kind of approach. And the 2019 showed a really notable shift in that strategy, that it's really, they're moving faster and farther than we'd originally seen, which I think also speaks to maybe some increased faith in the technologies, right? They're willing to say that, yeah, we think the technologies are there and the systems are ready to do this pace of a transition towards a decarbonized grid. So the next question, right, is that how are the new loads going to be met? And again, we look to the IRP for this, and again, really good news, right? It's predominantly with renewables, short duration, long duration storage. One interesting one that I felt is worth mentioning was there is also included in the plans is an eye towards what we call grid interactive efficient buildings, which is a mouthful way to say controllable loads. And it's basically the idea that if we are more strategic in when our loads are coming onto the grid and needing power, that we can actually avoid some of the generation needs, right? By instead of stacking everything up at once and having to have a peaker plant, we can balance it out, and so decrease the amount of generation sources that we need. And this is really important I think especially again for the design community, doing electric buildings, they need to be done in the right way, right? They need to be including this technologies and these control features that allow them to be grid interactive. And it is important because, again, you look at the IRPs and PGE does not include any fossil fuels in their plan, but Pacific Power does have a bit of a footnote that says, if these other things do not come online at, the scale that we need them to and the pace that we think they can and should, we may have to make some hard decisions. And so I think the ink's not quite dry yet. And so the onus, I think, comes back onto us in the design community and then in the facilities and operations communities to make sure that we are being active participants in bringing this solution to life. So the good news is, my research journey showed that yes, the grids are getting cleaner, and in fact, they are getting cleaner than even I had realized. And I work in this field, so that was really exciting to see, is that we're moving in the right direction and we're moving there at a good pace. I'm not going to be able to get into the details of these, kind of the other benefits that are found. I think some of the other speakers might talk to the indoor air quality one, but I will touch a little bit on the resiliency because we've had a number of clients who were really interested in all electric buildings, not necessarily for the sustainability piece of it, but particularly for the resiliency aspect of it. The studies are pretty clear that if we had a major seismic event in this region, that the utilities would be offline for potentially quite a while. And so if you're an emergency responder facility, you need to kind of have a backup plan. And so what we're able to do for those clients is set them up with an electric microgrid. And so on-site solar, on-site storage, and then a backup on-site diesel generator, and set them up in a way that they would be able to operate at some level, potentially indefinitely, with an all-electric building. And we just don't have that same equivalent available to us with natural gas. And then the possible pitfalls, right? What are the considerations? The equitable transition is a really important one, and Carmelita is going to go into detail on that. Refrigerants reduction, this is important, just in general, this is important. Refrigerant management was one of the #1 solutions in Project Drawdown, for those who are familiar with that body work. And this comes to policy, and I guess the takeaway is that it's electrification policy and refrigerant policy should just be done hand in hand so that both are moving forward. And if anybody has questions on this one, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. We're wrapping up a research and policy paper for City of Seattle and the C40, specifically around refrigerants and policy ideas. And then again, that, making sure that our all electric buildings are grid interactive, all electric buildings, so that they can participate in that solution. And the last one I'm going to touch on is cost, because this is the other big one that we always hear as a critique for electrification, is that it's going to cost so much more to operate. And this is definitely very regionally dependent. California has a very different utility rate structure than we do in the Northwest. But even in the Northwest, the cost per unit energy for electricity is a little bit higher than it is for natural gas. But what we've found in our projects and in our analysis is that as long as the systems are designed well, right, so you have a tight building envelope, you have an efficient electric system, that even though the unit cost is a little bit higher, you're using less units. And so your total cost of energy ends up being about a wash. And so again, it's, yes, you can have a very expensive electric building, but if you've done your design well, there's really no reason that it shouldn't be cost neutral. So that brings us to the last one, right? Have we reached the end of the bridge? Is it time to transition to the new energy future? And what this really comes down to is a question of emissions, right? We look at what is the emissions impact of natural gas use in a building versus the emissions impact of electricity use in a building. And the way that we do that is we kind of pull it back to, per unit energy. So the CO2 equivalent per kWh for natural gas equivalent, and then for electricity equivalent. And for electricity, we've got a pretty good understanding of what those rates are. I have another talk I give that gets into the weeds of that one, but essentially if you're looking at your specific utility, you can get a pretty accurate look at what your emissions rates are. The problem with the natural gas emissions rates is that we don't really know what they are. And that's, to me, I think what was most revealing about this little research journey of mine was just understanding how much we don't know about what they really are. I had always known that there was issues with them, but I hadn't really understood the extent of it. And the problem is that there is an official EPA published rate, and this is what's used in building codes. And there's a mounting body of evidence that it is vastly undercounting the actual emissions impact, and we'll see a little bit later why that's such a big deal. And what it really comes down to is this concept called super emitters, and it's essentially, the research has been starting to show, and there's quite a few studies on this, in fact, that there are these extreme leak events, and they are not necessarily being counted currently in the total emissions rates, and they are really significant. And so one of the studies showed that 5% of the leaks was contributing to 50% of overall emissions for natural gas, and they may not be in the accounting methods at all right now. And kind of a clear case of this was a situation that happened last year. This was in Ohio, and it was a leak, and the calculated emissions rate was that it was, not great, but it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that big of a deal. But what had happened was that there had recently been a satellite put into use that was specifically designed to monitor the globe for methane leaks. And so they were able to focus the measurement equipment on this specific site and do an actual, data measurement of what was happening. And what they found is that the actual measured leak was one of the worst recorded events in US history. And so I think what's so concerning about this, right, and I like this quote here of "you can't manage what you don't measure," is that it was one of the worst events that we know about, right? It just happened to be that they were able to match empirical data with the calculated data on this. And those are the emissions that we're not getting in that EPA rate. And the reason this is such a big deal is that the analysis on it has shown from a climate impact standpoint is that the crossover for where natural gas is less impactful than coal to being as impactful or potentially worse is around 3%. And so even though there's parts of the supply chain that are way less than 3%, if we have other parts of the supply chain that are significantly more than 3%, we potentially are ending up with, when we look kind of a wider lens at the whole supply chain, right, we could end up with a case where it's, in fact, total is more than that 3% kind of cut over. And the reason this is such a big deal is that the codes are currently structured around that EPA rate. And we've run into this, in fact, in all states on the West Coast. This is California, Oregon, and Washington, where codes were structured in a way that they were essentially incentivizing natural gas because it was done in a good faith effort to try and reduce the emissions of buildings. But what happens is that, and you can kind of see in the chart to the left here, that we're required to use an emissions rate for electric, which is likely too high, especially in Washington. This is what we had to use is kind of 0.8 was for all of Washington, even though Seattle City Light is closer to 0.04, so orders of magnitude different. We had to use this was our emissions rate, and then the natural gas rate, right, is the EPA standard rate, which is likely significantly lower than the total when we look at the whole supply chain. And this is how the codes are structured. And so we end up getting put into a position where even if we have an owner who really wants to go all electric, and even if we're able to provide the analysis that shows that all electric's the right path, we still end up having to go with natural gas. And kind of we did some internal work on it and said, well, if we adjust the grid, the electric rate to what we think its closer is, and adjust the natural gas rate to closer to what we think it is, what we find is that they're probably closer to being on par. So the conclusion, this was kind of the sad part of my research. My conclusion was that my thought that the natural gas, yes, it's an emission rate, so it's kind of going to plug along at that emissions rate, was probably wrong. It is most definitely higher than what we're currently reporting, and then as infrastructure starts to age, it seems likely that it could continue to go up. And although this was a little bit eye-opening for me personally, obviously there was plenty others in the field who were very well aware this and have been working on it for quite some time. Rocky Mountain Institute, Environmental Defense Fund have been put put tons of effort into addressing this very issue of leaks. And they'd had quite a bit of success. There were quite a few federal policies that were put in place around specifically around addressing the issue of the leaks and the emissions. And then, of course, we had a change in administration, and most of those have now been removed, rolled back. What's really interesting about this is that the outcry against the rollbacks was obviously from the environmental community, but also it was coming from the oil and gas majors, a number of which who have made some very interesting commitments towards moving towards zero carbon goals by 2050. And this actually goes against those goals. So they weren't in favor of it either. And publicly came out and said so, but unfortunately their voice also was not heard, and so the rollbacks did proceed. And we're starting to see some interesting activity at the state level as well. So California was smart. They went first and they went fast. The rest of us, unfortunately, no longer have the element of surprise available to us. And so there has been movement to ban all electric codes and reach codes. Arizona has already passed at the statewide level, passed that legislation, and then there's a number of other states who are considering similar measures. And even here in the Northwest, we're starting to see the pushback as well. Both Seattle and Bellingham kind of publicly came out and said that they were considering potential having electrification codes, and were met with pretty swift and fairly aggressive pushback towards it. So I don't know if we've seen it yet in Oregon, but it seems likely that those discussions are coming our way as well. So the silver lining, though, is that there are solutions that are out there. This is a bit of research from Environmental Defense Fund that found that there's actually, the technologies are available to deal with a lot of the leak and supply chain issues. And in fact, quite a few of them are cost positive. So it makes good climate sense and also makes good business sense. That's always great to see that. And then even in our kind of our local area here, right, Northwest Natural is our natural gas distribution company, and they've done some interesting work around what's called RNG, renewable natural gas. And I take a little bit of issue with it called renewable. I think reclaimed would maybe be a little bit more accurate, but it's basically the idea of capturing methane from other sources like landfills, and then repurposing it in a way that puts it into the natural gas chain. So, you know, some interesting ideas in that. I think there's still some kinks to be worked out, but it's interesting to see that there are maybe some technologies available that could help us deal with this now. And I think this was kind of one of my big takeaways, and sort of my homework that I give to you all, is to think about the transition. Like, what does this energy transition look like? Because the electrification is, you know, from this point moving forward, but it's sort of a two-part solution, right? Is like, yes, we electrify now and we move forward toward decarbonized from this point forward, but also still keeping an eye to where we have been and acknowledging that we have a lot of existing building stock with natural gas. And so making sure that we have the programs and policy in place for converting that to electric, and then just, you know, cleaning up the supply chain that we have now. And there's an interesting thing happening with the oil and gas majors, again, I said with the zero carbon policies, is that you go, well, how can a fossil fuel company go to zero carbon? And you start to look what their business model's doing, and they're actually transitioning from being a fossil fuel company to being energy companies. And I think that's sort of the takeaway out of it, right? Is that we need to be transitioning everything, existing and new, from fossil fuel to kind of this new energy model. So that was a ton of information very quickly. Key takeaways from where I am at least in my stage in the research journey, is preventing the bans on the all electric ordinances, making sure that option is available at the city level to do that, and then start working towards implementing it, right? Get the all electric codes in place for new construction, major renovations, and then start thinking about how we transition existing building stock. And then using accurate emission rates in building codes. This one is so key, because even if we're not doing all electric codes, at least keep the option open for people to do all electric, and for building owners to make that decision. And this likely means not using the EPA rate or using some modification of the EPA rate, which I know is a little bit controversial, but that's the only way that we can do it in a way that's accurate and is supported by the data. And then I think requiring accountability and transparency in the natural gas supply chain. You know, again, for better or worse, we're still locked in with natural gas in a lot of conditions for a long time. And so, you know, requiring that third-party verification and reporting and, you know, a commitment to a clean and well-managed supply chain, we need to be doing that kind of hand in hand with the electrification movement. And then last and certainly not least is that ensuring that everybody is included in this transition. So with that, that's all I got.
Great, thank you so much, Karina. We've already got a lot of great questions for you that we'll save to the end, but we appreciate that so much. And just a reminder, this is all being recorded, and we will have the YouTube video available afterwards. Let's jump into our next guest, Ken Davies, to talk about San Jose and their code from last year. Go ahead, Ken, take it away.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ken Davies, Deputy Director of Climate Smart San Jose. My main responsibility at work is to administer our climate action plan, which is the above name, Climate Smart San Jose, which is a Paris-aligned plan to keep us under 2 degrees C. And I'm trying to, there we go. Next slide. So why did we do this REACH code, and why now? We had a lot of stakeholder interest. We had our GHG reduction goals, and we also wanted to do more about improving air quality, both indoor and outdoor, and the resultant benefits in human health. So as Karina mentioned, the natural gas infrastructure leakages, you know, California gets about 80, I think it's 84% of its gas is imported from the Midwest. So it's a long way to travel with resulting fugitive emissions occurring along the way. We did the timing of our code around the 3-year iteration of Title 24, which is California's building electric code, and had to basically work back from that January 1 effectiveness date for the 2019 code, and kind of plan our process around that. As I mentioned, Climate Smart is San Jose's climate action plan. You can see some of our goals listed up there in terms of all electric homes, zero net carbon commercial buildings, EVs, and solar. Our proposed or our adopted REACH code is really about a commitment we made to the American Cities Climate Challenge. San Jose, along with the city of Portland, are 2 of the 25 cities across the country that were selected to have that assistance from Bloomberg Philanthropies. And what that did, or what that helped us with mostly, was moving very, very quickly from when I came into this position a little over a year ago in May, and we had an adopted code by September. So it was about a 5-month sprint that we went through there to get that done. Couldn't have done it without their assistance, on the technical side, but also through the climate advisor that was provided through that grant. So electrification, you know, simply put, makes us safer and improves indoor and outdoor air quality. We don't have the concern over underground gas infrastructure, which is going to continue to age and will be a liability that is reflected in gas rates over time and over a shrinking customer base as we electrify more and more. No gas in the home means no carbon monoxide monitor requirement and no harmful emissions coming off of gas stoves, which include formaldehyde, NOx, carbon monoxide, etc. So when we talk about electrification, we're usually focused on greenhouse gas reductions. However, kind of coming out of the COVID, well, we're not out of it yet, but in light of COVID, we are looking at our emissions as an impact to human health a little bit more. As opposed to saving the planet, maybe we should be thinking about saving human health, and because it really gets us to the same place. One of the things that's come to light recently was the American Lung Association's State of the Air report for 2020. And a little bit surprisingly to me, Bay Area metro air quality was pretty bad. Pre-COVID, 8th worst in the nation for ozone, top 5 in both short-term and year-round particulate levels. And particulate, we know, is bad, especially in the current setting, because of the Harvard study that came out early April, talking about the impacts of particulate matter and the increase in COVID mortality for those that are in the proximity of those sources. To be fair, PM is primarily generated by the combustion of diesel, but prior to COVID, air pollution in general was estimated to be killing about 7 million people a year globally. So we should stop burning that stuff. And then, not coincidentally, we know that the pollution burden, at least where we live, falls most heavily on our already disadvantaged communities. And that map's a little bit hard to read, but lines up with what we know about where those communities are in San Jose. You'll recall from Karina's slide, lots of jurisdictions in California moved ahead with REACH codes around the same time. And yes, there is a strong correlation to CCAs, or community choice aggregation utilities, being present. San Jose Clean Energy is ours. I think California is only one of, I believe, 9 states that has legislation in place to allow for CCAs. And what they are really quickly are just kind of an energy broker or energy middleman. PG&E is our investor-owned utility. They still own all the wiring. They own the meters. They all the transmission lines, everything like that. And so they're still making money off of the sale of electricity, but a CCA can kind of move into the middle and do the procurement of that power, hopefully from green sources. So San Jose Clean Energy is going to be 100% carbon-free by next year, 2021, which is a phenomenal thing to take before your electeds and say, here's a really good reason why we need to electrify, because we're getting rid of, we're zeroing out emissions over the foreseeable short-term horizon. Getting into more of the specifics about our code, we adopted it in September of last year. The mayor and city council asked us to bring back a natural gas prohibition, which we did a month later, which applies to single family dwellings, detached ADUs, and low-rise residential buildings up to 3 stories. And right now we're in the process, we had a little interruption from the pandemic, but we're in the process of getting back to council with some additional analysis on expanding that gas ban that they asked for. We'll be going to them next month to deliver the analysis and get their go-ahead to bring an expanded ordinance back probably around September. So this is side-by-side of code requirements for all electric versus mixed fuel in San Jose. It's called an electric friendly ordinance, or electrification friendly. And what that means is, or where the incentive is built in, is that if you build all electric in San Jose, you are just meeting the state's Title 24 code regarding the building envelope. If you want to have mixed fuel where we haven't already prohibited that, you will have to have some added compliance margins. You will have to have electric readiness, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. We also added, as part of our adoption, requirements for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So part of what was adopted is a solar readiness where it already wasn't required by the state. And that's really just identifying a zone on the roof that could one day hold solar, as well as conduits or pathways from the roof to the electric service so that they can get that done at some future date. It's ready to be installed, kind of plug and play. One of the things about our code that has been a little bit more surprising as we've implemented it over 2020 has been the electrical readiness requirement. So any building that does still elect to have natural gas in it has to install what we call electrical readiness. And that means, again, conduit to, let's say, a water heating area from the panel, so it's all ready to go at some future end of life date for that gas equipment, so that it can more easily be swapped out for electrical equipment. What that does is it adds cost in addition to the added compliance margins that we have built in already for mixed fuel, but it also adds kind of I think a bit of undefined cost in terms of having enough electric service for that future date. So what that speculation has resulted in has really been projects that, for the most part, have already wanted to be all electric, really kind of tipping them towards that side. Here's some of the emission benefits we presented to council last year. Again, San Jose Clean Energy being carbon neutral, so just renewables and hydro by next year. And what it would look like based on the stringency of our REACH code. We don't show the all electric yellow bars on there because once we get to that in 2021, they won't be there. There won't be any emissions associated with our buildings, the new buildings. Cost savings come about at the time of construction because you're not installing natural gas infrastructure in the building. You're also not paying a pretty hefty connection fee to the utility. We were already seeing a bias towards this before our REACH code was adopted in terms of buildings you see on the screen there that have been constructed around the Bay Area. And then in terms of stakeholders, we had some formal processes, and then as people realized kind of how fast it was coming, we started to meet with individual developers and construction companies about how to interpret our code and what it would mean. All of that was super useful in us kind of fine-tuning and course correcting the code that we ended up bringing before council. Post-adoption, but pre-effective date of January 1st of this year, we had a building experts roundtable that we held, and that was to bring in our building and developer community, talk to them about the code that would go into effect on January 1st, how to interpret it, how to build to it, and then also to discuss what would be different if we expanded the gas ban to buildings taller than 3 stories. I should say that one of the things we've been dealing with post-implementation has been the compliance modeling. So the California Energy Commission is the body that approved all these codes. They're basically local amendments to the state's building electricity code. So they had to have a 60-day comment period and then approve them at a board meeting. They went ahead and approved all those cities that you saw on previous slides without necessarily having a lot or very clear compliance modeling pathways in their software. So a builder is going to plug all these different components of their building into that software, and where it's kind of getting tripped up is on centralized heat pump water heating systems. So those are when you get into the taller buildings, and they're going to replace like a large scale gas boiler to provide hot water. One manufacturer is in the current approved version of that software. One configuration is in there. So where you would be innovative as an architect and designing super efficient all electric systems, you don't necessarily have a way through that right now. So something we're spending a lot of time on right now, especially for projects local to us here in San Jose, is how to get through that compliance pathway with the state, so that then the city's building department can then approve the projects. Sorry, I just have some pop-ups here on the screen. As I mentioned, the CEC modeling issue, we're working closely with projects, especially affordable projects, which are so critical to get built at this point in time. We do have some flexibility in the code. The EV charging infrastructure is pretty aggressive in our code requirements. And so some projects can avail themselves of a hardship exemption to get around some of that requirement, so that they're not, in some cases, doubling their electric service needs to charge all those vehicles. And then we'll just be collecting that data over time and reporting to council on that periodically. And one cool part of this was that we won an award from a local urban planning group. So that's always nice to have that recognition. And with that, I think I'm done and can pass this back over to Joe, if I can figure out.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ken. Really appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions for you at the end, but really fascinated by the example that San Jose set. Let's turn it over to Andria Jacob from the city of Portland. Go ahead, Andria.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I just want to say thank you for having me. This is the first time in 9 weeks I think I've put on a work shirt. So it was nice to have the excuse to actually be a presenter instead of just lurking in the background. I think, Ken, you need to stop sharing your screen so I can share mine.
Yeah.
Stop sharing, Ken. That'd be great.
Working on that.
Okay. Should be at the top.
There we go. Oops. Nope.
There you go.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. So I decided to sort of frame this as our net zero carbon policy in Portland. Electrification is one piece of that, and I think it's really interesting to follow Ken in San Jose, and you'll see in all the ways that Portland and Oregon are not California through this presentation. So just to run you through what I'm going to talk about, I like to start kind of by just reviewing what our climate and energy goals are, what they look like, and then to review our carbon emissions inventory, so you have a sense of why we're even talking about this, and then I'll talk a little bit about our framework for how we're thinking about this. So it's and where electrification fits into the overall policy conversation around net zero carbon, decarbonization, all of those terms. Sorry, it's just hard seemingly. Okay, so Portland has had a climate action plan for a very long time. It is actually currently out of date. It has an 80 by 50 carbon reduction goal. What kind of has superseded that as we're going through a climate action plan update is our 100% renewable energy resolution that council passed in 2017, which puts us on a path or commits us to being 100% renewable electricity by 2035 and 100% renewable in the heating and transportation sectors by 2050. And I think one of the really important pieces of that resolution is the justice focus and the centering of frontline communities and just transition as we move to 100% renewables. And Ken mentioned the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Declaration, our participation in C40. We also have committed to be net zero carbon in all new construction in our municipal buildings by 2030, and then for the rest of the building stock by 2050. The council is going to be considering what we're calling a climate emergency declaration later this year, which will update those climate action plan goals to basically be 100 by 50 or net zero by 2050. And it also will move up. The proposal right now is to advance that 100% renewable electricity goal up 5 years to 2030 instead of 2035. So that's the framework that we operate in and the policy context that we have for the work. So a little bit about our carbon inventory. So this is information as of 2017, which are the most recent numbers that we have for Portland and Multnomah County. So this is kind of a good news, bad news story. Despite our 26 years of climate planning and mitigation in Portland, our carbon emission reductions, while having gone down fairly steadily for quite a while, have started to plateau over the last couple of years. So even though those two, the blue and the orange line, are showing that we have welcomed 38% more people here over this time frame and we've increased jobs, we have been able to bend that curve down. So that's the good part of the story. I think the less good part of the story is starting to happen here in 2014, 15, 16. You're starting to see a lot of this. And then now we're starting to go back up. So from 2016 to 2017, residential emissions increased 17%. Commercial emissions went up 6.4%. Some of that detail is lost in this slide, but it is the nuance of our story. And that transportation emissions in particular have increased every year since 2012. So I know mostly this is a buildings focused conversation, but I will be nodding to the transportation side of this throughout the presentation. So where we are currently is that transportation sector emissions are now 8% over 1990 levels. So from a sector-based perspective, this is also helpful for folks to understand where Portland's carbon emissions come from. 40%, which is a combination of that bubble that says 22 and 18, that comes from our residential and commercial sectors, the energy used to run, heat, cool, power our homes and businesses. And then that big bubble, that 42%, is the transportation emissions that I mentioned. So those, it used to be that we were much more, not much more, but more buildings emissions focused and transportation was less. Those proportions have shifted over the last couple of years. If you're looking at our emissions by source, electricity generation is the single largest source of local carbon emissions at 28%, but underlying this is burning of coal and natural gas. And since Portland is served by Portland General Electric and Pacific Power, our electricity emissions are still higher than the Pacific Northwest as a region. And even though Karina mentioned that our grid is getting greener, and that's true, it is important to point out that currently, or at least as of 2017, 63% of our grid mix in Portland is still sourced from fossil fuels. And then we have gasoline at 25% by source, and then natural gas in Portland, and this is that 20% is direct use natural gas. So if you actually consider the natural gas emissions from electricity and direct use, natural gas is a very sizable chunk of the emissions in Portland. Okay, so this is a framework that my bureau, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and the Bureau of Transportation, given that we're both addressing, PBOT addresses transportation, and we really work on the buildings and energy side. Together, these two bureaus have been collaborating on a framework about how do we get to net zero carbon. Leading with the climate justice frame, putting an equity lens on our energy policy and program decision making and engagement, and the same on the transportation side. But this would be a familiar framework for most of us in this field. Number one is you've got to consume less, whether that's reducing vehicle trips on the transportation side or consuming less in your buildings on the energy efficiency side. First and foremost, we just have to use less fossil fuels wherever they are. Number two, as Karina mentioned, we have to use cleaner energy. We have to green the grid and make sure that everything is being sourced from as close to 100% clean electric grid as possible. And then third, really of importance to us at the city, between BPS, which is the long range planning framework, that we are responsible for the long range planning framework, and PBOT, the way that we use land, the way that we build communities and construct roads and all of that is really important. And I'll talk a little bit about that more. So planning and building sustainable communities is a really important part of our framework, obviously all leading to net zero by 2050. So back to the building sector. So obviously priority one, energy efficiency. We have a couple of policies that are on the books around energy performance and disclosure for the large commercial buildings. Buildings that are 28,000 square feet and larger report energy use to the city, and we disclose that. Been doing that since 2015. We do that on the residential side too with home energy score. Both of those are information policies, and at the time they were passed, they were leading edge for their time. We're starting to recognize that that we need to continue innovating on the policy front. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we are starting to examine for the existing building stock, what is that next generation of net zero carbon buildings policies. On the new building side, in one of the ways that we're different from California, this is a state building and energy code. Local jurisdictions cannot go above or below it, which constrains us quite a bit. So we do, one of my colleagues, I believe, is on the line as well, or on the webinar, and a core chunk of his work is engaging with the state building code process, making sure the governor's executive orders are being implemented, and trying to work with the state to have integrity and accountability in the building codes process is sometimes challenging. And then all of this work, again, is we are at least intending and working on making a shift towards centering frontline communities, both in the process and in the substance of how we do the work. So they're, in some cases, really trying to cede power and let community lead in determining what some of these building and energy policies and transportation policies are. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And I'm going really fast because I want to be mindful that we have time for Q&A. On the second, a lot of the work that we end up doing is supporting the development of renewable energy industry in the state and in the city. We've historically focused on distributed generation and rooftop solar. Solar Oregon had a huge role in probably our most significant successful renewable energy program ever, called Solarize. And we quintupled the amount of rooftop solar in like 3 or 4 years in Portland through that effort. We did recognize, though, with an equity lens on it, that the benefits of those programs were accruing to middle and upper class white families with equity and homes and property, so not really strongly equitable. So we shifted and have been shifting to community solar since then, and really trying to center communities in that. Community solar is sort of seen as an anti-displacement mechanism. It's seen as a community wealth building tool. And we have been really trying to support community in getting their arms around that tool for community wealth building since 2011, and working a lot with the state and the statewide Oregon Community Solar Program. We also really are focused on resilience, as other folks have mentioned. That pairing of solar plus storage is really important. It's important for the grid, it's important for individual buildings, and it's important for communities. We'd like to see in our sort of 20-minute neighborhood concept, our compact neighborhood, sustainable neighborhood development construct, that we would have resilient power supply in all of those communities. So if you're supposed to be able to walk or bike to everything you need within 20 minutes of your house, then there should be a microgrid within that framework too. So that's what renewable resilient power for Portland is. It's a planning effort to try and scale up microgrids at a neighborhood scale. We work very hard to be 100% renewable in our own city operations, and we're also really focused on working with the utilities and advancing transportation electrification, really with the focus again on multi-dwelling areas of Portland where there are high concentrations of renters, lower income folks, people of color, and making sure that benefits of these policies accrue much more equitably and more justly than they have historically. So the meat of this is on, I used to call this electrify the rest, is decarbonize the rest. I just want to recognize that in the Pacific Northwest, this is a pretty complicated picture. I don't think we have the mantra that we're charging ahead, electrifying everything, perhaps the way that other communities and areas are. This is a winter peaking area, and there's a strong interdependence between the electric and natural gas grid systems. Natural gas delivers a tremendous amount of energy during the winter. So we really need to be mindful of how we do this transition and really making it equity centered and affordable as well. So I think one of the first things we're looking at doing is just analysis. We're looking at decarbonization pathways. There are multiple decarbonization pathway studies out there. None really look specifically at the city and the county as its own jurisdictional unit. We're inferring a lot from the utility decarb studies, from the one that that the Clean Energy Transition Institute did, which we think is very useful and interesting. And then I'm also working, on my team with a staff member who's leading with Architecture 2030, a really in-depth scenarios analysis of our building stock and different policy interventions that could bring our carbon emissions down in each of the building sectors. So analysis is a big part of this. I think we are in agreement at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability that the natural gas system of the future is going to be smaller, any way you slice it. The throughput declines in a decarbonization scenario by 2050. So adding new gas infrastructure to that system seems like it exacerbates the cost and equity issues. So that is something we're mindful of. And we do definitely see a pathway for renewable natural gas. We have a really great flagship project at the City of Portland at the wastewater treatment plant, where we're taking that methane that would have been flared and converting it to renewable natural gas for the transportation sector. And so that's a harder to electrify, harder to abate sector. It seems like the highest and best use right now for that RNG. I think, we know that Oregon has studied their technical potential for RNG. There is some, for sure, but we do have concerns about the ongoing supply of sustainable biomethane. So those are parts of our analysis that we're taking into account. And we've been informed, I think, to some degree by the Pacific Coast Collaborative and some information coming out of California about the recognition that if you transition folks off the gas system too quickly or in an unmanaged way without an equity lens, you're going to end up with folks that are least able to bear the cost of a shrinking gas distribution system. We don't want to see those folks shoulder the burden, and wealthy white people leave the system first because they have the information and the money to electrify, and then you've just exacerbated this whole problem. So California has used these words around a managed stakeholder process. I think the city really sees a need for that. I'm not sure that the city should be leading it. It does seem like a state level kind of conversation, whether that's the Oregon Department of Energy or the PUC. I think there are other bodies that might want to lead it, but we want to be a very, active, engaged member of that and help design it or inform it. And if the state is not going to move on the time frame that we have, then I think the city will be willing to step up. But this is where we're at. It's like, what does that process look like? How do we address all of these complexities around cost and timing and equity in a way that brings all the stakeholders to the table? Because I agree with the previous speaker who said that the gas company needs to be at the table, community needs to be at the table, jurisdictions need to be at the table, so utilities need to be at the table. So we need to figure out what that table looks like and who's setting it and how it goes. We don't have the answers to that yet. And then after we sort of figure out what a process is, that's going to lead to policy solutions. One project I'd like to mention is a project that is called the Zero Cities Project, and Vin Mason, who's on the phone, this unnamed colleague I keep referring to from BPS, he has been working with community over the last year or so to really kind of flip the script in how we do building policy development and putting community in charge of developing its own priorities around what does a net zero carbon building stock look like. And that process, which really went deeper into community than we have before and started building capacity among community members, specifically Black and Brown community members, to talk about where their lives intersect and what their lived experiences with energy and buildings, has led to the identification of minimum energy efficiency standards, performance standards in multifamily and single family rental housing in particular. So the focus being rental housing, and also making sure that pairing any rental housing standards with incentives and protections, incentives for the building owners that need to make the upgrades, and also protections for renters so this doesn't lead to displacement, packaging equity in buildings together in that way and letting community lead has really been a surprising journey and a very heartening journey. Community cares about these issues, and if given the opportunity to lead and to share their experience, will land in a place where I think the city can then advance policy that is equity-centered and people-centered. And we're trying to do the same thing in the transportation space as well. So hopefully what we're going to see over the next couple of years as we move forward on building performance standards focused on rentals first, large commercial buildings as well. That's a building sector we already regulate, and it doesn't seem like that far of a leap to get to some kind of advanced building policy for large commercial buildings. We know we need to take a look at embodied carbon and sustainable consumption and production, which is a part of our inventory I didn't really get to talk to, but the emissions from things that we consume and build are extremely significant, as well as the sector-based emissions. And pricing is going to be a big part of our toolkit going forward, both on the transportation side as we look at congestion pricing, equitable congestion pricing, and then putting a price on carbon, hopefully at some level, is going to be a big part of the policy toolkit going forward. And then I also mentioned that we were looking at, since we don't control the building and energy code, but we do control the zoning code, there's some tools that we have in land use that can really ensure that maybe we can get to this building decarbonization quicker, specifically around EV readiness. We don't feel like the state is really keeping pace with where we need to go. So we are investigating how you could use the zoning code to advance EV readiness in buildings. And finally, I think we're really interested in partnering with the electric utilities on demand response and grid interactive efficient buildings. We're part of the smart grid testbed that PGE is running. So making sure that the grid can be as flexible and interactive and create a market as much as we can for these ancillary services that will make the grid integrate renewables better and make it more responsive and easier to decarbonize. I think that's all I wanted to say on the electrify / decarbonize the rest. I'm sure there'll be questions, but here's my contact information if anyone wants to follow up, and I will hand it back to Joe.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Andrea. We did have people wanting your contact information, so that's fantastic. If you could stop sharing your screen whenever you're ready, and we can we'll send out all the slides afterwards as well. Great. So without further ado, let's go to Carmelita Miller for equitable electrification. Take it away, Carmelita.
Hi, everyone. Just give me a second, sharing the screen. Here we go. Like Joe said, I'm Carmelita Miller. I'm from the Greenlining Institute, and I'm currently the director of the Energy Equity Program. Greenlining, for those who don't know, is a racial justice organization based in Oakland, California. And here we envision a nation where communities of color thrive and race is never a barrier to economic opportunities. One of those areas of opportunities we focus on is energy, because energy programs and policies, as you know, have a tremendous impact on communities of color. About a year ago, Greenlining got into the building decarbonization issue. I think it's not news to many of you that there really aren't a lot of organizations that have the bandwidth and the capacity to pay attention to and be involved in the policymaking around building decarbonization. At the time, we recognized that our community's voices were being left off, right? Our partner organizations, racial equity organizations, and environmental justice organizations were just not at the table. We weren't part of the conversation. So what we did was we invited organizations throughout the state, throughout California, and we specifically picked organizations from different regions, representing different issue areas for their constituents. So, for example, we invited ratepayer advocates, low-income utility advocates, environmental justice advocates, workforce advocates, so that, you know, during this one convening, we can really get different perspective from different community members on what the needs are. From that, we ended up developing, or during that convening, we ended up developing a collective vision for what building decarbonization and building electrification really means to us. And that's the vision that you're looking at here now. That building electrification must focus first and primarily on the goal of improving the health and resilience of people, and all communities must have the opportunity to shape the benefit from building electrification policies. Why does building electrification matter? I think all of the speakers here, and you all know about the different benefits of building electrification, but I think for environmental justice communities that are usually hit first and hardest by economic, health, and environmental consequences, it's even more critical for the benefits of a policy like this to really get into these households. I do want to talk about the result, or not the result, the impacts of COVID-19 to our communities, right? So I do appreciate Ken for talking about that, and Andria for focusing on the equity issues that our communities are experiencing and how that fits into this. But I do want to pause and just make sure that it is part of our conversation. I was
just a real quick, your paper's blocking your face.
Sorry. Trying to, I apologize. I'm working from home and I don't have my multiple screens on me, so I'm trying to juggle everything in front of me. Thank you for saying that. So going back to COVID-19 and the impacts on our communities, when we're talking about building electrification, we're talking about, possibly spending a lot of money and making sure that our homes are of course, are healthy and resilient. But we also need to keep in mind now that in a state like California, we're facing an unemployment rate that is higher than during the last recession, right? And so if that is the case, then who is going to be left out of the policy? Charge or pathways that we're talking about. And I think, and many of us might be thinking this, it's going to be communities of color, frontline communities. And I think it's just worth mentioning that while Greenlining created the framework that I'm about to present to you before COVID, the same principles still apply here, if not even stronger. And we're advocating to all of you that what I'm about to present today is even more important in the way that you're considering how you're charging ahead in your policies in the cities. We also think that a focus in the city is very critical to the environmental justice advocacy around building decarbonization. We think that equity actually lives within the cities, right? In the past, and if we're talking about historical racism, the city's participation or intervention has made that difference for our communities. And in decarbonization, it's the same thing. And so advocates like me would really love to forge a path ahead as partners and figuring out how we can provide a more equitable result when we talk about decarb policies. I will be using frontline communities, also a term called environmental and social justice communities. And I put a slide here to define what that is. It was created by the California Public Utilities Commission with a disadvantaged communities advisory group. But really quickly, when I say environmental and social justice communities, I mean them to include people of color living in on low incomes, underrepresented in policy setting or decision-making, disproportionately impacted by one or more environmental hazards, likely to experience disparate implementation of environmental regulations and socioeconomic investments, and living in disadvantaged communities and tribal lands. I want to talk about barriers as well, because I think even as I said earlier, as an impact of COVID is hitting our communities, as Black and Brown communities, community members are dying from this pandemic. We want to make sure that we really understand what we're facing when we go out there and say we want to electrify everything, right? Prior to COVID, our folks were already unable to face a transition anyway to all electric. We're experiencing, communities are experiencing energy insecurity that is currently at an all-time high. There is a recent report, and this is from the utility, oh my goodness, TURN. I'm forgetting what the R is in that acronym. But there's a TURN report on disconnections that stated that between 19 to 25% of Californians are actually experiencing high energy insecurity. And for those who don't know, energy insecurity is the inability of our community members or of people to pay their energy bills without trading a basic household or need, such as household expenses, food, medical care, and childcare. So, you know, right now, right before COVID, our disconnections rate are already very high, right? And while in California, there's a moratorium on disconnections and disconnecting folks, we actually don't know what that's going to look like after after we reopen our economy. It will be a lot worse, right? And that's what we're expecting. And so we're facing communities that are not only not thinking about electrification, but cannot really prioritize that as they can't even access energy at their homes. Renters too have very limited choices. Even if higher income renters can somehow afford the upfront costs, and we all know this, I think, they don't have the property rights to make the kinds of changes at home, especially very low income renters. They need their landlord's permission, who may or may not have an incentive to switch. And if the landlord decides to switch, they might want to switch the building away from fossil fuel and end up increasing the rent or getting our community members displaced. And I think this is one other thing that Andria had highlighted in her presentation earlier, that we want to make sure that decarb policies do not inadvertently cause displacement. In California, where homelessness is already at a pandemic level. There are also some regulatory barriers that I think, again, we all know about, but it's worth just mentioning again. There's a lack of program and funding alignment that create a really confusing landscape especially for low-income programs, right? Or the programs that are meant to benefit our community members. Most of the housing stock where ESJ residents live need more than just energy upgrades. These buildings often need to be treated for mold, asbestos, or structural issues, like damaged walls or leaky roofs, etc. Existing incentive programs for energy retrofits require that homes are free of these problems. But what do we do when these structural barriers are actually in the way? Do we just skip these buildings? Do we just skip these homes and not think about how to decarbonize them? And that's currently an unanswered question for us. Many residents are also very interested in understanding the health benefits of decarbonizing our economy, decarbonizing the home they live in. They don't understand too well the connection between the use of fossil fuels or gas and climate change. A culturally appropriate education and awareness campaign about the topic of building electrification, delivered by trusted messengers from the communities, such as community-based organizations, could actually increase awareness of the fossil fuel ecosystem, its presence in our homes, leading to more engagement from our communities. So we need to figure out how the decarb policies and programs can help lessen or work around these barriers as soon as possible. The risks to communities remaining on gas, such as possible increases in energy bills and possible safety and reliability concerns, will exacerbate the hardships that our community face. And we want to make sure that we really understand what these and stop talking about them in hypothetical sense, but actually look at the plans, look at and analyze what we have in the system, and figure out what are the risks if communities are redlined, right? If communities end up being left on an aging gas system and are left to pay for that, what are the hardships that they could be facing, and how can we prevent that from happening? Our framework offers 5 steps to really approaching this process in an equitable way. I've heard from our speakers today elements of these 5 steps already that's surfacing from their plans. And so I'm really happy to have seen that. The first step here is to assess the community's needs. We need to understand the barriers that are preventing our community members from electrifying their homes, and think about the residents' knowledge levels regarding building electrification and their specific needs and concerns. So I know that I've highlighted a handful of barriers in this presentation. I do not at all want to assume that these are the only barriers that our communities are experiencing. Different neighborhoods and communities are different, right? One could be experiencing an over-the-top disconnections rate, but maybe in a different community it looks different, right? Their problems look different, and so really step 1 is a very beneficial. A very beneficial part of the process, so that we know what could be stopping us from proceeding with our policies. Step 2 is establishing community-led decision-making. That's my alarm. So I'm gonna just quickly, I'll try to get through these steps very quickly because the next slide is actually a lot more important. So step 2, establish community-led decision-making to involve people in the steps that you're doing locally in getting to the decisions. Step 3, develop metrics and plan for tracking. How do you measure if you're actually doing something equitably? And you only can do that if you pre-develop metrics for equity metrics that you can then track. And step 4 is improve the funding and program leveraging between the different existing low-income programs or programs that are meant to benefit community members. And 5 is improve outcomes. Constantly evolve your process to make sure that you're actually meeting your equity goals. I know that I went quickly through that, and it's because I wanted to talk to you about and just say a little bit of the story of the San Joaquin Valley pilots, where all of these 5 steps are actually being implemented. So we know it can be done, right? And we know it can be done in an equitable way. In California's rural San Joaquin Valley, the color of your skin remains the primary indicator of whether you have access to essential public infrastructure, like ability to access clean water, clean energy, and housing. Right? Compared to white households, Hispanics and African Americans in this 8-county region have nearly 3 times the rate of poverty, 3 times the rate of unemployment, and half the per capita income. What's important to this webinar, though, is another characteristic that these households have. They had no access to gas. A bill called AB 2762 required the California PUC to open a proceeding in order to provide access to cleaner and more affordable energy to the Valley residents. And again, I'm fast forwarding a little bit here because there's a lot of the things that happen in this proceeding. But through the leadership of the assigned commissioner, Guzman Aceves, and partnership with local community-based organizations and activists, the commission approved 11 pilots, and I think that's about 1,800 homes. Where so far, and I need to refresh my information here, but the last time I checked, there's at least 9 of these 11 pilots that include electrification of these low-income disadvantaged communities' homes. The central objective of the pilot is to ensure that all households, including those occupied by tenants, experience a bill savings, right? So as a result of the pilot, they do not suffer any negative unintended consequences, including rent increases that could also cause displacement. In the proceeding, they also established what they're calling common community elements. And these community elements mean that every single pilot has things like participant outreach and education, bill protection for all electric customers, workforce training and local hiring, landlord-tenant participation and agreements, and the availability of contingency funding and some data gathering requirements. So my point here is that the biggest lesson that we've gotten is that we established the framework, and we know that this is already happening. The commission actually worked with the CBOs to make sure that residents are not just, I think they weren't just polled, right? There were actual meetings held at night, held when the residents are not at work. They were given support for childcare, they were given food and transportation support, financial support, so that they can actually participate in the decision making. They did things like voting, right? They voted for what kind of energy they actually want to have access in their communities. So more than just reaching out, handing a pamphlet to community members, what the commission did here was the right thing. They engaged with the residents and they actually involved them in the decision making. And the result in the end is that we still got pilots that are mostly going to have building electrification, right? I wanted to leave you with that story. We're hoping that the San Joaquin Valley pilots, and we think that it's going to meet, its goals and will succeed, and have this as an example to everybody that you can focus on our communities and you can provide the benefits using building electrification as a tool. I'll stop here because I know we're really out of time, and looking forward to connecting with anyone who's interested in talking about these, the framework steps some more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carmelita. Great. Like any good webinar, we've just blown through all of our time projections. So we'll try to get a question for each of the panelists, and then any other leftover questions we will ask the panelists in a separate email to respond. I think because we're taking a lot of valuable people's time. So go ahead. Brian's going to lead up our questions. Go ahead, Brian.
Okay, great. Maybe we'll do them in a reverse order a little bit, since we just heard from Carmelita. Thank you, Carmelita. That was fantastic. I was really curious about your comment about culturally relevant education for these communities, so that they understand these ideas and the potential benefits, et cetera. Have you seen good examples of that we could potentially learn from and use here in Oregon?
Yeah, so we're currently working with our approach right now is to work with administrators of low-income energy efficiency programs and message that through the current messaging for energy efficiency, because we're already hitting on the messages around health, safety, and comfort, which is really what matters to our community members, right? I'll say that, in some of the discussions in the San Joaquin Valley pilots around what is the benefit of building electrification, folks were really at first unsure about the health impacts of using fossil fuels at home. And these are homes, again, without that have been using wood or propane within their home. And so I think even just talking about why if we're approaching your home and we're weatherizing your home, we're putting solar on your home, why all of that is going to lead to an improvement of your health and the resiliency of your household, right? Your kids are gonna, kids' health are gonna improve. I think that kind of approach makes sense to people, because otherwise, what we're hearing is that messaging has just been in theory to a lot of them. They're not really understanding the actual impacts within the home. And I think there's a lot of education about the impacts of carbon and outdoor air pollution, but we haven't really gotten into the education for indoor air and the health impacts of that.
Yeah, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. And there's just seems to be more and more information about that coming out all the time that we can use. So that sounds great. I love that approach. Andria, just kind of building on that a little bit, there was a question I think you answered in the Q&A, but it might be good for everyone to hear about the Portland Clean Energy Fund and electrification. And I know this is a little bit TBD because that isn't actually paying out money yet, but I know there's a lot of talk about how some of these concepts could be helped, particularly for disadvantaged communities with that money. What are your thoughts about that?
So I answered that the program, the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund, or PCEF as we call it internally, is working on establishing its grant criteria now, and they'll be releasing their first RFP for proposals later in the summer. And so my understanding is everything's on the table still. And so as long as these projects can be shown to benefit people of color and low-income Portlanders, then that should be open for proposal. I don't see anything that would prevent that. Certainly affordable housing and multifamily housing has been a focus of where I think a lot of interest for PSEF and the and community intersect. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw proposals that focus on that. But yeah, it seems like it should be on the table.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can't wait to see how that all plays out, because that just seems so exciting, and it's a lot of money. I mean, it's significant funds that are going to be available through that, which is fantastic. Ken, I have a question for you. Awesome presentation. San Jose is obviously making a really good example for the rest of the world, and Oregon for sure. I hope we get somewhere close to what you're doing soon. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to anything you might have heard from the public reaction to this. I mean, what are people saying about all electric buildings, and is it too soon to get that information, or what do you think the feedback has been? Are there people that are up in arms about not having gas stoves, or tell us a little bit about what the public is saying about these things?
Well, going into our council process, we had a very, very active and aggressive environmental NGO community kind of pounding down the door saying when and go farther and all that good stuff. And they have been tremendous allies in the process. So I think there was never really a question of not doing it. There are some market barriers that we identified in some analysis that we're bringing back to council now. In that high-end rental or apartment units are associated with having a nice big gas range. So we're partnering with folks right now, like the Building Decarbonization Coalition, to essentially get a PSA kind of campaign out there and really educate people about the drawbacks of using natural gas, especially indoors. Yeah. And so that's one area where the code was way out in front of kind of the public and market awareness, because people just aren't aware of that. It's branded as natural, right? Yeah. And so people think, hey, it's probably okay to use.
Yeah, gets you back to that public information. Yeah, we were just talking about with Carmelita. I mean, it's important for everyone. Okay, I think we have maybe we can squeeze one quick question in for Karina. There were a lot of good ones. I think I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the need for the electric grid to get bigger because of all these things we've been talking about. The capacity is going to have to go up, and what the capacity is to do that, and are we potentially introducing other problems like battery storage from an environmental standpoint? Could you just quickly touch on those things? I know those are two big topics.
Yeah, let's see, describe my whole life's work in 5 seconds or less. Let's go. Yeah, I mean, that is kind of the question, right? And that was one of the things that I know myself and a lot of my colleagues were really interested in when we look at it, right? Because it's the question of how are the grids going to handle the additional load. And that was one of the kind of key questions I was trying to look at. And what I would say is that's the one where the ink's not dry quite yet, right? Is that there are pathways available with technologies that exist currently to get us to where we need to be. It includes things like not using energy, right? Efficiency is a huge part of that as well. And then that load shifting aspect, right? When you look at what the grids are trying to hit, it's because, everybody comes online, everyone comes home at the same time, they turn everything on at the same time, right? And so if you can start to shift those around, so that way your, hot water is heating during a low use time in the grid, and that way it's ready for you when you need it, but it's not happening at that time. Same thing with electric vehicles, right? Looking at staging when we charge them and not having everybody charge their electric vehicles at the same time, but spreading it out evenly over a 24-hour period. So I think that's a critical component of that expansion piece, right? Is that it's not just what new sources are we putting on, but it's also a more mindful approach to how are we using energy and when are we using energy. The batteries have a role to play, I think, both short duration and long duration storage is going to be part of it. What I will say is I do a lot of work around emissions accounting, and so the idea of embodied emissions, right? When you build a product, there's emissions associated with it, and so batteries is one that's certainly pretty high on my mind, right? Because it's that question of what's the manufacturing emissions associated with batteries if we're going to put a bunch of batteries out into the world. And what I would say is PGE has a pretty interesting pilot that we've been working with them on, which is trying to take one asset and use it for two purposes. So I talked about that resiliency piece, right? And so knowing that we need batteries on the grid for this kind of the grid support services, right? The place where the renewables can get stored. And then knowing that we need batteries for resiliency, right? When the grid's not there, finding a way to use one battery to serve two purposes. And that's kind of what we're working with them on, is some clients who had resiliency needs, also had sustainability interests. And so we have one battery system that during normal operation will serve sustainability purposes, right, grid support purposes, and then is there for resiliency purposes in the event of a major outage. And so I think those kind of more creative solutions, right, are going to be really important to make sure that we're not just buying a ton of batteries for this purpose and a ton of batteries for this purpose, and then causing a different environmental issue to be addressed.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks. Wow. Thanks, everybody. This is this has been my dream team of panelists on this issue. So thank you to Ken, Andrea, Karina, and Carmelita. Thanks to Brian for co-hosting with us. Thank you guys for all for joining us. We will have a YouTube video of this sent out to all tomorrow, and we'll also be getting slides from our presenters as well. So thank you to everyone for being here today on this important conversation. Have a great rest of your week, and hope to see you on June 4th for our solar shingles webinar. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.